Good morning. Good morning. Our opening words are from Henri Nouwen. Solitude breeding solitude. That's what community is all about. Community is not the place where we are no longer alone, but the place where we respect, protect, and reverently greet one another's aloneness. When we allow our aloneness to lead us into solitude, our solitude will enable us to rejoice in the solitude of others. Our solitude roots us in our own hearts. Instead of making us yearn for company that will offer us immediate satisfaction, solitude makes us claim our center and empowers us to call others to claim theirs. Our various solitudes are like strong, straight pillars that hold up the roof of our communal house. Thus, solitude always strengthens community. For our chalice lighting this morning, I would like to welcome up my friend and Kitchener-Waterloo MPP Catherine Fife to read our chalice lighting words for us this morning.
Thank you very much, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. Let this flame be to us a symbol of the wholeness we seek, its brightness dispelling gloom, lighting a path to faith and hope, its glow reminding us of the sacred bonds which link us to all people, its radiance calling us to seek justice, equity, and compassion for all the world.
Our guest speaker today is a member of this congregation, Mark Andrew Nouwen. He will be sharing some of his thoughts with us this morning, and like the rest of us, he is a work in progress. He and I share similar religious backgrounds in our childhood, and the experience of leaving our family's religions is also a similar one. When we get together, he and I share some of the pain of that process and some of the excitement of finding new pathways for ourselves. We recognize each other as fellow travelers along this road, and we support each other in our new journeys. My friend, Mark Andrew Nouwen.
Thanks, Jay. Jay has been a true brother of mine since the first time I walked into First Unitarian Congregation of Waterloo, up on Dunbar Road in Waterloo, and I cherish his friendship. It is a real privilege to be here with you this morning, my religious family, and to share this morning's sermon with you. I deeply cherish this community which supports one another and celebrates diversity, as well as a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. As I was thinking of where to begin this morning, I thought of a moment 15 years ago that would have a dramatic impact on my life. The year was 1998, and I was on my way to not finishing a bachelor's degree in religious education at a Bible college here in Kitchener. I possessed two very strong traits back then. The first being that I loved to read, and the second being that I was almost always in a state of spiritual crisis. Knowing this, a friend at the time lent me a book called The Inner Voice of Love, A Journey Through Anguish to Freedom by Henri Nouwen. The book is a compilation of journals or spiritual imperatives that Nouwen wrote to himself over a 6-month period in 1987 and 1988 when he was suffering from major depression over the loss of a close friendship. Immediately, I could relate to almost every page. His raw honesty was just what I needed at that time in my life. However, little did I know that fast forward 15 years, and Henri Nouwen would have such an impact on my life that I would change my surname to his. Today, I'm not sure whether to call Henri Nouwen my spiritual father for all that he has taught me and continues to teach me, or my spiritual brother, as I have dealt with many of the same things as he did in his life. Henri Nouwen wrote 40 books in his lifetime. This morning I will focus on his 1975 book, Reaching Out, the Three Movements of the Spiritual Life. But first, I want to share a little more about the man himself, who is pictured on your bulletin this morning. Henri Joseph Maciel Nouwen was born in Nykirk, Holland in January of 1932. From a very young age, Henri emulated his maternal uncle Anton, who was a priest. While other kids were playing sports or games outside, Henri was in an upstairs room playing priest, and he'd recruit as many of his friends as he could to play church with them. Although he would go on to be educated by Jesuits, he decided not to become a Jesuit priest because it would mean too much study. Instead, Henri studied for 6 years in a major seminary in Reisenberg-Dreibergen and was ordained a priest for the Diocese of Utrecht on July 21st, 1957. Although church circles felt that it undermined faith, Henri was interested in the field of psychology, something unusual for priests at that time, and he studied psychology for 6 years at the University of Nijmegen. During this time, he also worked briefly as a pastor in the mines, a chaplain in the army, and a chaplain on the Holland-America line, accompanying immigrants to the United States. Following his graduation, he went to the Menninger Clinic in Topeka, Kansas, studying in the Religion and Psychiatry program. He spent 2 years there, from 1964 to 1966, working in clinical pastoral education, research, and writing. During this time, Nouwen also grew more politically aware. He participated in Martin Luther King's Great Civil Rights March from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. It was after his time in Kansas that Henri's teaching career would begin in earnest. He taught at Notre Dame from 1966 to 1968. This is where his prolific writing career began as well. He wrote and lectured on themes of depression, intimacy, and love. Placement in his classes were highly sought after. Following Notre Dame, he returned to the Netherlands to teach pastoral psychology and spirituality. In 1971, Nouwen began 10 years of teaching at Yale Divinity School and became a fellow at the Ecumenical Institute at Collegeville, Minnesota. This study opened him to men and women of other faiths. Ecumenism would become very important to Nouwen, at times to his disadvantage. For instance, Henri would hold regular Mass at the schools where he taught, and he would gladly serve it to people of any faith. During the early 1980s, Henri became interested in the political and theological developments that were so deeply affecting the poor in Central and South America. He decided to leave Yale in 1981 to spend 6 months discerning whether to live with and serve the poor in Peru. Although this proved not to be his calling, his visits to the South expanded his worldview and deepened his engagement with social justice. From 1983 to 1985, Henri taught at Harvard. This quick backgrounder on the history of Henri Nouwen and his whereabouts may be helpful, but what kind of person was Henri? By all accounts, Henri Nouwen was an extremely generous person, sending flowers or other gifts to friends and family, even if he was on another continent. Henri was an enrapturing lecturer, often flailing his arms about and raising his voice as if pleading with his students to get his point. Henri had a gift for translating deep spiritual truths plainly for his readers. Unquestionably, the main theme of his life was to convey to others that we are all the beloved of God, no matter who we are or what our capabilities are, no matter how much money we make or if we have physical or mental handicaps. He wrote a book called Life of the Beloved. Some of his other popular titles are The Wounded Healer, The Return of the Prodigal Son, and Making All Things New. Henri was a curious man. He always wanted to learn, whether it was about politics in South America, the traveling circus, or human rights in Selma. However, Henri Nouwen was also, through much of his life, a very lonely and depressed man. He would go away and stay with friends for weeks and seek to only be physically held by them. One such time was in 1987-88 when he wrote journals, later compiled as The Inner Voice of Love, after a heart-wrenching breakup of a friendship. Not only was Nouwen constrained by his priestly collar, he was also a celibate gay man. In the mid-1980s, Henri had a chance meeting with Jean Vanier, son of former Canadian Governor-General Georges Vanier and founder of l'Arche, an international movement of communities that welcome people with disabilities. This inspired Nouwen to spend a year writing in the original l'Arche community in Trosley, France. He felt at home there, and in 1986 accepted an invitation to become pastor for the l'Arche community of Daybreak in Richmond Hill, just north of Toronto. Although initially feeling inadequate in this community of people with sometimes severe disabilities, Daybreak turned out to be his homecoming. He lived in one of the homes and was eventually asked to help Adam Arnett, a young man with a severe disability, with his morning routine. Henri wrote a book called Adam, God's Beloved. It describes how Adam became his friend, his teacher, and his guide. After recovering from the severe depression mentioned previously, Nouwen began to experience perhaps his deepest fulfillment as priest, friend, author, lecturer, and mentor. He gave countless talks and retreats, welcomed hundreds of people for counsel, and still found time to write. Whenever he traveled or lectured, he invited a core member, a person with a disability, to accompany him as a co-facilitator. His contribution to the spirituality of L'Arche was as profound as the transformation he experienced at Daybreak. Henri Nouwen, while giving so much rest to other people's souls, often did not take the necessary time needed for his own rest. Relatives and friends alike were candid with Henri about his unrelenting schedule. En route to Russia to do a documentary about Rembrandt's painting of the prodigal son, Nouwen suffered a heart attack in the Netherlands. He died on Saturday, September 21st, 1996. There were two funeral services, one in Utrecht, the Netherlands, and the other near Daybreak. Nouwen was placed in a simple wooden coffin with personal messages written inside by those in the Daybreak community with disabilities. Numerous vases of sunflowers surrounded the coffin. He is buried in Richmond Hill, close to his beloved Daybreak community. Jean Vanier, in his eulogy, said the following: "How are we going to live on without Henri? How are we going to be together as we feel the biting pain of his absence? Nobody can give answers to those questions, but we must trust that together we will discover new life among us. In fact, it is already happening. Henri's funeral has brought together people who are not comfortable in each other's presence. Healing and reconciliation are opening in the open space that Henri has left behind. The open space of a prophetic vision where we are not only Christians, but others who are searching for truth, searching for love, searching for a real spirituality, a spirituality that will flow from the broken hearts of people, not through power, but through the wounded hearts of people. So we must fill this empty space." Henri Nouwen was only 64 years old. It is a pleasure this morning to share some words and themes from just one of Henri's books, Reaching Out, The Three Movements of the Spiritual Life, and to supplement them with some thoughts of my own. As previously mentioned, Reaching Out came out in 1975. He was teaching at Yale at the time. Of this book, Henri said, "This book is closer to me than anything I have written and tries to articulate my most personal thought and feelings about being a Christian." So it will be interesting to glean some insights as a Unitarian. This book is about reaching out to ourselves, reaching out to others, and reaching out to God. The first movement, according to Nouwen, is the movement from loneliness to solitude. He writes, "Loneliness is one of the most universal sources of human suffering today. Psychiatrists and clinical psychologists speak about it as the most frequently expressed complaint and the root not only of an increasing number of suicides, but also of alcoholism, drug use, and many other symptoms. Children, adolescents, adults, and older people are in growing degree exposed to the contagious disease of loneliness." He then adds, "Why is it that many parties and friendly get-togethers leave us so empty and sad? Maybe even there, the deep-seated and often unconscious competition between people prevents them from revealing themselves to each other and from establishing relationships that last longer than the party itself. Where we are always welcome, our absence won't matter that much either. And when everyone can come, nobody will be particularly missed. Surely, each of us here today has at some point in our lives experienced a degree of loneliness. Sometimes it is just a passing tinge, but for others it cuts through to the soul on a daily basis. For many of us, myself included, it turns into clinical depression, and we must seek professional help. Nouwen also speaks of how many people latch on to others, almost demanding that they fix their pain. We also numb out with alcohol. We spend hours in front of the Xbox. We post endless amounts of nothingness on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, hoping against hope that someone, anyone, will pay attention to us. Inevitably, people cannot live up to our expectations. Henri encourages us to move from a place of loneliness to a place of solitude. When we think of solitude, the imagery of monasteries or nunneries may come to mind. And while these may be a good fit for some people, what is most important is that we have a solitude of the heart. He writes, on occasion, an isolation is necessary to develop this solitude of heart, but it would be sad if we considered this essential aspect of the spiritual life as a privilege of monks and hermits. Solitude is one of the human capacities that can exist, be maintained, and developed in the center of a big city, in the middle of a large crowd, and in the context of a very active and productive life. When we live with the solitude of heart, we can listen with attention to the words and the worlds of others. But when we are driven by loneliness, we tend to select just those remarks and events that bring immediate satisfaction to our own creative needs. Nouwen says that we all fluctuate between the poles of loneliness and solitude, and that the trick is in recognizing them. Loneliness, he says, leads to quick, often spastic reactions, which make us prisoners of our constantly changing world, while a real spiritual life in solitude does exactly the opposite. It makes us so alert and aware of the world around us that all that is and happens becomes part of our contemplation and meditation, and invites us to a free and fearless response. How do you practice solitude? How do you get in touch with what Nouwen calls your innermost self? Is it by going for a walk in the woods, journaling, Tai Chi? Perhaps you meditate. Whatever it may be, adding an element of solitude to our daily lives is essential. I now move to the second of Nouwen's three spiritual movements. He says that our movement from loneliness to solitude helps us in our quest to move from hostility toward others to hospitality instead. The movement from hostility to hospitality is hard and full of difficulties, Nouwen writes. Our society seems to be increasingly full of fearful, defensive, aggressive people anxiously clinging to their property and inclining to look at their surrounding world with suspicion, always expecting the enemy to suddenly appear, intrude, and do harm. We can say that during the last years, strangers have become more and more subject to hostility than to hospitality. In fact, we have protected our apartments with dogs and double locks, our buildings with vigilant doormen, our roads with anti-hitchhike signs, our subways with security guards, our airports with safety officials, our cities with armed police, and our countries with omnipresent militaries. Although we might want to show sympathy for the poor, the lonely, the homeless, and the rejected, our feelings toward a stranger knocking on our door asking for food and shelter is ambivalent, to say the least. People who are unfamiliar, speak another language, have another color, wear a different type of clothes, and live a lifestyle different from ours make us afraid and even hostile. As I read through that this week, I realized that I do the very same thing. Me, the loving, caring Unitarian. I regularly cross the street so as to avoid the homeless man downtown. I become easily irritated by people carrying on a conversation in a different language while riding the bus. So how do we move from hostility to hospitality? The German word for hospitality is, and I hope there's no Germans in the crowd, Gastfreundschaft, which means friendship for the guest. The Dutch word, which I'm not even going to try to pronounce, means the freedom of the guest. Hospitality, therefore, means primarily the creation of a free space where the stranger can enter and become a friend instead of an enemy. Its goal is not to change people. It is not to bring women and men over to our side, but to offer freedom. It is the liberation of fearful hearts. It is not a method of making our version of God and our way into the criteria of happiness, but the opening of an opportunity to others to find their version of God and their way. Hospitality creates a friendly emptiness where strangers can enter and discover themselves as created free. Free to sing their own songs, speak their own languages, dance their own dances. That's beautiful. We cannot change the world by a new plan, project, or idea. We cannot even change other people by our convictions, stories, advice, and proposals. But we can offer a space where people are encouraged to disarm themselves, to lay aside their occupations and preoccupations, and to listen with attention and care to the voices speaking in their own center. I love this next quote by Henri Nouwen, who, remember, was a Catholic priest. In our world in which so many religious convictions, ideologies, and lifestyles come into increasing contact with each other, it is more important than ever to realize that it belongs to the essence of a Christian spirituality to receive our fellow human beings into our world without imposing our religious viewpoint, ideology, or way of doing things on them as a condition for love, friendship, and care. This morning, I am thinking of Malala Yousafzai, who at age 15 was shot in the head last year by the Taliban in Pakistan, simply because she was a girl seeking an education. Fast forward to just this past Friday, 2 days ago. Malala turned 16, and she addressed the United Nations about the importance of education for every child. In a remarkable speech, she said, "Dear sisters and brothers, I am not against anyone. Neither am I here to speak in terms of personal revenge against the Taliban or any other terrorist group. I am here to speak for the right of education for every child. I want education for the sons and daughters of the Taliban and all the terrorists and extremists. I do not even hate the Taliban who shot me. Even if there was a gun in my hand and he was standing in front of me, I would not shoot him." 16 years old. So how do we move from hostility to hospitality? We must create a space within ourselves and become at home with ourselves first. We can practice this by solitude. We can only acknowledge another's pain when we can acknowledge our own. We can only acknowledge another's poverty when we have acknowledged our own. Finally, the third and final movement that Nouwen speaks of is a movement from illusion to prayer. Prayer. Now there is a tricky word. Almost as tricky as God. Were I to ask each of you what these words mean to you, I may get as many answers as there are people present this morning. Here Nouwen uses language that I simply do not connect with anymore, though I can still appreciate what he is getting at. He says, "In order to convert our crying loneliness into a silent solitude and to create a fearless place where strangers can feel at home, we need the willingness and courage to reach out far beyond the limitations of our fragile and finite existence toward our loving God in whom all life is anchored." Continuing, "It is through this movement that we reach out to God, our God, the one who is eternally real and from whom all reality comes forth." He also describes prayer as the expression of a most intimate relationship. The meaning of the word God has drastically changed for me since those evangelical days. Rather than describing a supernatural person like man in the sky, God to me is the ground of all being, my highest thought, the energy behind all that is. Prayer is a word I seldom use, as it often has guilt associated with it in the past, though I still find myself reaching out to this ground of all being. Now it talks about the illusion of immortality and characterizes spiritual illusion as being full of idolatry, sentimentality, and our dreams. Prayer, on the other hand, to him, is an intimate relationship with God that can lead us to both certainties and uncertainties. I can connect with Nouwen's assertion that God is mystery. Nouwen finishes his book by talking about techniques or methods of praying. But rather than going through all of them, I prefer a quote from another of his books, Life of the Beloved. The real work of prayer is to become silent and listen to the voice that says good things about me. To gently push aside and silence the many voices that question my goodness, and to trust that I will hear the voice of blessing. That demands real effort. It is my hope that you have been enriched by this message from Henri Nouwen this morning, as we've looked at his life, as well as the spiritual movements from loneliness to solitude, hostility to hospitality, and illusion to prayer. Thank you. Friend to generations of children. When I say it's you I like, I'm talking about that part of you that knows that life is far more than anything you can ever see or hear or touch. That deep part of you that allows you to stand for those things without which humankind cannot survive. Love that conquers hate, peace that rises triumphant over war, and justice that proves more powerful than greed.